Welcome, everyone. My name is Michaela Bowman, and I'm a Vice President at Impact Justice. I'm really pleased to be here today to have this conversation with our distinguished guests, Shamika Gaskins, Alex Duran, and Alana Jackson, all of whom I'll introduce shortly. Before we get started with our conversation, I'd like to set the stage with a few reflections of my own. So over the past several years, Impact Justice and other US criminal legal system reform organizations have led trips to Norway and Finland to learn about the Nordic model, typically focused on prisons, but also more broadly, their criminal justice systems. I've had the privilege of traveling to Finland and Norway on three separate trips in 2017, 2019, and 2023. I want to start by addressing the inevitable, unavoidable skepticism that a lot of people express, and I have shared at times about the value of such trips. That skepticism, I think, is natural and perhaps right in light of the fact that these Nordic countries bear so little resemblance to the United States in so many ways, and the notion that we have something valuable to learn from them, something that's translatable to the reality in the United States, can seem absurd. There are other sources of skepticism that I think rightly question the value of holding up the justice systems in these countries as a model when they remain oppressive in ways that it's too easy to be blinded to when struck by the shine of what you see as a visitor. And of course, what you see as a visitor isn't everything. There are a lot of other critiques. I won't get into them all, but I think that question, why is this valuable, is one that's worth answering. So the first answer to that question for me is kind of a broad general one, and that is that in my experience, the travel in itself, that opportunity to learn on the ground about another culture, and in this case, in our trips, to examine their criminal justice systems, no matter whether you think you're looking at a system you admire or one you find exceptionally flawed, can be really clarifying. That space to reflect on our work at home and the challenges we face from a distance through the lens of another country's challenges and the very different set of choices that they make, I think has proven valuable to everyone who's been on our trips. I think regardless of the views our travelers brought with them, they left with having found value in that space for a reflection that comes from distance and the opportunity to view our situation at home through a point of comparison. The other answer to the question for me is much more specific to the two countries we've visited, Norway and Finland. So in the decades during which the US went from a country with a rate of incarceration comparable to most European countries, and we love to compare ourselves to Europe, I think it's worth noting as an aside that there are countries outside of Europe with even lower incarceration rates. But we went from this country with incarceration rates comparable to Europe to arguably the most incarcerating nation in the world. And during that same period of time, during those same decades, and actually in a slightly more condensed period, both Norway and Finland looked at their responses to crime and their approach to punishment and their prison systems and decided that they didn't like what they were doing and chose to do something dramatically different. So it isn't that I think we need Norway and Finland to provide a model to lift up and transport here. To me, what's powerful is seeing what it looks like when a country commits, even imperfectly, to a different set of choices and follows through on those. There are really interesting examples of that with Norway, which we may get to talk about later, but I just focus in on Finland. Finland looked at the indisputable mountain of evidence that shows that the numbers of people you have in prison, your rate of incarceration doesn't impact crime rates. And they said, okay, let's incarcerate half as many people, even fewer than half. And they did that. It didn't have any impact on their crime rates, but they did it using strategies that many people in the United States have advocated for here. And for me, what's valuable about visiting and seeing it is seeing that proof of concept in action, not necessarily a concept we could or even would want to follow precisely here, but simply seeing that it's possible to choose differently, that the outcomes are so dramatically different when you do choose differently. It's not that I don't believe that, right? It's not that I don't believe that in the abstract or that I have to go to Finland or Norway to believe that, but there is something I find truly energizing and motivating about seeing it in practice. So with that, I am going to introduce our three panelists before I turn to them with questions. We have three people with us. Our first is Shamika Gaskins. Shamika joined us in 2019 on a trip to both Norway and Finland. She is the president and CEO of Grace End Child Poverty California. She's worked in law and public policy, specializing in legislative, regulatory, and policy issues associated with criminal justice reform and children's rights. She formerly served as the acting Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she worked to develop and implement innovative policy initiatives of the department and administration in areas such as smart on crime, law enforcement and emerging technologies, prison reform, reentry, and issues affecting children with incarcerated parents. Shamika serves on the boards of Impact Justice and California Budget and Policy Center, and is a commissioner on the LA County Commission for Children and Families. Our second guest, Alex Duran, joined us on our trip to Finland in September 2023. Alex is a program director of criminal justice reform at Galaxy Gives, where he leads strategic investments aimed at dismantling systemic injustices in the U.S. criminal legal system. He serves on the boards of Freedom Reads, the Center for Community Alternatives, and the Medical Justice Alliance, amplifying his commitment to transforming the conditions of confinement and advancing community-based alternatives to incarceration. Alex's roots in advocacy trace back to his work at the Center for Community Alternatives, where he counseled individuals entangled in the justice system and helped drive the organization's broader reform initiatives. As a vocal advocate, he played a role in the movement to raise the age of criminal responsibility in New York State. And finally, but not least, Alana Jackson, who also joined us on our trip to Finland last fall. Alana is the Deputy Chief Investment and Impact Officer at Blue Meridian, where she works across portfolios, partnering on strategy development and implementation, managing cross-portfolio operations, and providing strategic and executional leadership on critical business priorities and innovation efforts. Before joining Blue Meridian, Alana was a partner at the Bridgespan Group and led the firm's Boston office, as well as its criminal justice practice area. She worked with donors and nonprofit organizations to develop strategies for significant scaling of impact, with an emphasis on advancing philanthropic collaboratives, structuring big bet investments, and unlocking funding for policy and advocacy work. Welcome to all three of you. I'm really pleased to have you with me today and really looking forward to this conversation. So my first question is a question for Shamika. We tend to start the conversation about Nordic prisons in the wrong place. That is, we start with the prisons themselves, rather than how these countries keep people out of prison. Norway and Finland have what they refer to as a social welfare approach to public safety. They treat housing, education, and job opportunities as preventative responses to crime. So can you talk more about what we learned there and what the significant differences are between Norway and Finland's social welfare approach and what we see here in the United States?
Well, thank you, Michaela, for having me and for the opportunity to kind of share what we learned on the trip together. And I think I'm really happy that we are starting in this place, because that's the thing that I think struck me the most as we went to learn about the prisons and prison conditions. But you can't divorce that from the context in which these countries operate in terms of their social welfare approach. And unlike the US, just starting with Finland, you know, it's a country that provides extensive social support for families, and that mitigates a lot of the social and financial challenges that we often see here in America that can lead to system involvement. So from the start, even when we talk a lot about early childhood in my work, you know, Finland is providing families with support in three main areas: financial support by the way of a child allowance, so that every child born until the age they reach the age of 17, that family is getting actual cash resources, regardless of the child's nationality. And the most interesting thing is that if you are a single mother, you are getting more. And there's a recognition that there's a higher cost for you to bear and taking care of your child by yourself. And so you have, you know, a child allowance, you have, as you said, housing loans, housing allowances, a free healthcare system, early childhood, free public school, free school meals, something we've been fighting for and just really getting across the country in the United States, and 14 months of paid maternal and paternal leave. So you have fathers in the country taking, 80% of fathers are taking the 14 months of paternal leave. And so there's a different value statement about the family, what is important. And it's no wonder that UNICEF ranks Finland as the fourth country globally for child well-being. But what we learned was that it wasn't always that way. So like in the 70s, the expenditures that they were spending on sort of social services was rather modest. But by the 90s, as you were saying, there was this big push and a realization that they were now developing pension schemes and improvements on their health and social welfare programs. So that brought their average cost up to more like their European counterparts. And what they were able to do is really manage their systems so that family well-being was the center, so that independent of this family structure or prevailing market conditions, that they were able to reduce, successfully the income inequalities that people were facing, which we often know can lead to system involvement. So as they were shifting, Finland and Norway and others, to these supportive social welfare approaches to be preventative for incarceration rates, you have us in the United States doing the exact opposite, as you said. And we often think about the war on drugs and the crime policies, but there's also the social welfare policies that were ushered in the Reagan era, right? And so you have the Nordic countries taking the best interests of the child and totally reshifting their child welfare system, where we are looking at families who are suffering from the conditions of economic depravity and saying, well, we're going to take your child, put them in the child welfare system. They were actually looking at ways, how do we reduce these large institutions? How do we make sure that it's voluntary, that we're providing the family unit support that they need so that it's not neglect, but it's actually giving them the basic needs that they need to support their children. Whereas here, we're pathologizing the Black family, we're developing the welfare queen, we're talking about the war on drugs and the super predator youth, and ushering in the framework to really begin to dismantle federal social programs, cut jobs and opportunities, divest from public education, and accelerate mass incarceration into the 1990s. So when we think about, as you said, these policy choices, and in my work, we're often talking about how poverty is a policy choice, and if we don't make different choices, we can have system involvement in the United States. In contrast, we see these robust social welfare programs really serving as the preventative factors, really ensuring that we're reducing family stress, we're lowering the risk of system involvement, where people will have their basic needs and more met, and it creates a safety net that helps children and families and the whole country thrive, and limits the unnecessary family separation and I think systemic punishment that we see here. So there's a lot to learn.
Thanks so much for that. Alex or Alana, is there anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, I just like a huge +1, of course, to everything that Shamika just said. And I guess it caused me to reflect on the first day. I think it was the first day of our trip where we met with some professors who were kind of talking about not necessarily a direct comparison between Finland and the US, but the sort of, if you painted two ends of a spectrum of the kind of set of social conditions and cultural conditions and government choices that would lead to a more social welfare kind of based criminal legal system versus one that's more punitive. And I think, Shamika, you were speaking to a lot of these, but it really brought to the fore for me, not just the ways in which, the specific social welfare programmatic choices, but also what is the role that the media plays in that? What is the role that even like the structure of your government plays in that? And the way that we have a more winner take all system, which creates a lot more, tension and sort of the sense of winners and losers and more polarization versus creating more of a basis for consensus. So though I thought those dynamics also were just really interesting, like almost the context behind the context, that if you were to line up the US and Finland, it's not that we would, maybe be at completely opposite end of the pole on everything, but it was really striking the kind of uphill battle that we have, just given the context in many parts of our society and culture.
Yeah, can I add one example to that I think was really striking to me? It is the daycare. So, we continue to fight for subsidized childcare in this country, and that's an actual right for every preschooler to have care in Finland. And so that means that the country is providing that care, even if the family has shift work or night work. Like, they are coming up with the solution versus us really shifting that burden to families in a way that just is untenable in our country. So yeah, I really appreciate you talking about the politics to even do the basics here is really hard.
Yeah. Alex?
Yeah, to me, it was a paradigm shift when we went to the organization that was focused on ending homelessness as a way to get at, issues of crime and the way that they think about fixing the housing shortage, and even issues of the built environment and how that sort of relates to behaviors. Like they just think so differently from the way we do, and do not center law enforcement and strategies for public safety. They just don't.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate all your responses. I'm going to turn to our next question. Just for the folks who are listening in, we will have time at the end for a Q&A. So I just to let people know about that. So my next question is for Alex. I want to get into what the prisons actually look like, because in many ways they're really different from what we see in the United States. And I want to hear from you, Alex, what was the most striking or unexpected thing about the prisons that we saw on our visit? What did you learn about the physical conditions inside? And in your mind, what is the impact of those differences between Nordic prisons and our own?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the introduction earlier, Michaela, and to the Shelby and Sheely at Impact Justice for putting this together. Appreciate it. And it's an honor to be with Shamika and Alana in this conversation. When we first arrived at Helsinki prison, it looked like a facility that at first glance mirrored the sort of architecture and infrastructure of a maximum security prison in the United States. But once inside, it was completely different. And it just felt staggering difference. The silence, the cleanliness, the absence of bars, and the seemingly intentional focus on humane conditions immediately struck me. This wasn't a place that was designed to break people. It was a system intent on preparing individuals for reintegration into society. In stark contrast to the cacophony, the chaos, the violence, and despair that saturates so many American prisons. We encounter individuals who were treated as students and workers, and most importantly, people with the potential for growth. It was a vivid reminder of what a rehabilitative justice system could look like, a vision almost unrecognizable to those of us familiar with the United States model, which too often reduces people to the worst moments of their lives. The second visit was to Suomenlinna prison, which is an open prison, and the difference between the Finnish and American incarceration model became even more striking there. It's located on a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the open men's prison felt like a functioning community rather than a detention facility. There were no gates, no locks. It just seemed incredibly porous. Saunas, which is an ingrained part of Finnish culture, were also included as part of daily life. And for that, that piece was the most unexpected for me, actually. The entire environment felt designed to heal and not harm, really. And yet, I think we must resist romanticizing Nordic prisons, as Michaela alluded to at the outset. Although humane conditions may appear as the ideal model, it's critical to understand that prisons in Finland and across the Nordic countries really are just one small element of a broader social safety net, rather than the catch-all solution to the system's failings like we have here. Finland has built an extensive social infrastructure that provides education, healthcare, housing, and employment opportunities, as Shamika mentioned, the very foundation of a society that seeks to prevent harm in the first place. The prison system in that context is simply a byproduct of a much larger vision of well-being. But there's also a darker side to the Nordic model, one that is often ignored. And as the far-right political movements grow, these societies have increasingly criminalized immigrants, and their prisons are filling up with them. In fact, incarcerated individuals in Nordic prisons commit suicide at rates 64% higher than in the rest of Europe, which is a direct consequence of the widespread use of solitary confinement. What this tells us is that even the most progressive prison systems can become tools for racial and social control when the broader social infrastructure starts to crumble or even not apply to certain people, as we saw in Finland when we visited their parliamentary. American history has shown us that no amount of reform can address this inhumanity inherent in locking people in cages. And to me, the most valuable part of going to Finland is that it didn't have to be this way for us. We could have made some different choices. And for centuries, we've tried to reform our way out of this inhumane system, making prisons slightly less brutal and slightly less dysfunctional, or rolling back the tidal wave for incarceration that started in the 1970s. But these efforts end up becoming part of a long historical narrative of failed reforms because they don't challenge the fundamental question: why do we rely on incarceration at all? The Finnish experience, for all its differences, shows us that even in systems that prioritize rehabilitations, prisons ultimately still serve as a means of social control. In the US, we've been trying to humanize and tweak our prisons for centuries, but we just cannot reform our way out of the system. And the question is not how to make prisons more comfortable or humane vis-a-vis the Finnish model, but how to create a society where they are no longer necessary, which to me is what the Finnish example offers in the infrastructure that they built that actually offers a way out of this morass that we've been in.
Thanks so much for that, Alex. I really appreciate those remarks. And I think it is really important to keep in mind all the ways that they don't live up to their values and the extent to which that does seem, at least now, to be driven by an anti-immigrant sentiment that is not identical to the racism that shapes our own system, but has real echoes of it. I'm curious whether Shamika or Alana have anything to add, about what you saw in the prisons themselves. I know, Shamika, you also got to go to Norway. If you have any reflections about what we saw there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alex. There's a lot to take away. And I think, so the entire trip, we kept saying, what's behind this? Like, give us the real story, and we were talking to some of the foreign nationals, okay, what is it really like for you? Because we really could not believe in some of the ways, is this a dog and pony show or is this real? And I think for me, it got back to where you started, Michaela, is they're not perfect systems. In no way should we be lifting them up as a model to transport here. But I think what was really striking, particularly in Norway, as someone who's visited prisons as a child, as a lawyer with all the privileges afforded me, walking into maximum security prisons, there's still a level of anxiety and disrespect, even as a visitor. So you can't even imagine what you feel as someone who is incarcerated. But that anxiety level is not there, which I thought was the first thing that was really striking, as Alex was talking about silence. Even as someone who's visiting, you're not being strip searched in the same ways that you are here. The indignity of being able to show up and not know, am I getting in today or not, because I might not have the right clothing on. Some of those things were really got us back to this centering of human dignity. And I think particularly when we talked about the interaction with families. So, and even though it's a maximum security prison in Norway, there was a house there, and I just could not believe what I was looking at. There was a house for family, for those who are incarcerated, to spend a whole week with their family in this house, with toys for children, the freedom to walk the grounds, and then the whole From the minute you walked in, they had this frog that was everywhere. And we're like, what is this about? Is this like a mascot? Like, what is going on here? And they're like, well, no, actually, we have this frog everywhere because when the children come or their families come, we want them to not feel stressed that their loved one is in a very, is in a bad place. And so there's all these different ways in which they're trying to mitigate, I think, the psychological things that stick with you when you visit a US prison, undoubtedly. So I thought that was really important to see a vision that things could be different. Not that we need prisons at all, but that the fact that they were thinking about the outside community and not just the punishment of everybody that has to touch the criminal justice system, families included.
Yeah, I think all of those things were really striking. Is there anything you'd like to add, Alana?
I really think Shamika and Alex have covered it really well. I guess this point, it can feel a little bit funny to focus on like the saunas, right? That's a big feature of Finnish culture. But I guess what it took me to was this, just the step back and the acknowledgement that things that are an important part of your culture and your definition of what it means to be, human, wherever you happen to be in the world, right? The way that there was much more attention to that. So a few other examples that I found particularly striking. One was, and I don't remember which prison, I think it was one of the women's prisons, where there was a comment made that it was really important to mothers to be able to cook for their children when they visit, right? It wasn't not, so sharing a meal, but also a meal that your mother had prepared, like that was important. And so there was attention to like creating that space and creating that opportunity so that, for both the mother to feel like I am doing this parental thing, and for the child to feel that. I thought another example, which really caught me off guard, was, one of the prison guards who was attentive to the women's need to be touched and to experience affection, right? And she was trying to think about, how the lack of that led people to make certain choices, like to enter into marriages, right? To sort of gain access to that affection and to visits. And were there other ways to satisfy that very human need that might, not result in some of the negative consequences that people sometimes, I guess, according to her, were entering into marriages that were not like based on sort of a full set of consideration of the factors, right? So I found those examples really striking, like, oh, that seems so different from the way that our prisons are so focused on stripping humanity from people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think you've all sort of touched on something that really strikes you from the beginning, which is that for all of the ways in which it is far from perfect and problematic, the genuine concern about people's individual humanity and what we do to support people, even inside the most, kind of secure of prison environments, really does strike you. And it feels genuine, because it's not just how they articulate it, but it's there in the way that they are running their institutions and the thought that they've put into all of that. So I'm going to turn to Alana with the next questions. And Alex alluded to this, but in the last decade, there have been growing calls for the U.S. to decrease its record incarceration rates, and many have looked to Nordic countries as examples of this done correctly. At the same time, we see like really challenging things happening in those countries. Given the differences between the U.S. and Finland, what lessons can we take from their efforts to reduce the number of people behind bars and apply in the context of the American legal system?
Great. So I'll just share a couple of things that, one, I'll just say are very consistent, I think, with the work that I see leaders in the reform field doing, right? So it's not like rocket science, including leaders that I have the privilege of sharing the screen with right now. And also I want to say, in some ways, the word lessons kind of struck me. I thought of them more as like implications for our work, because the context is so different. And it made me think about, what I sort of left the trip with was, what more can or should we be doing to try to be shifting that context, right? So the first thing that came to mind is the narrative work, which I think I saw someone bring up in the chat, comment on the importance here. And I've really been reflecting on that. We don't have the kind of foundational social assumptions, cultural assumptions about, trust between different groups, belief in humanity that is sort of, or the right to dignity that is sort of widespread. That's not, I don't think that's like foundational in our culture, unfortunately. And so without some of those things working in our favor, I think it really makes it even more critical that we are working on the narratives that are going to motivate people behind justice reform, that are going to motivate people behind really like feeling that we need a different system. And so what are those narratives? And I feel like what I've seen in the past, I don't know, maybe it's like 5 or so years, is this kind of a coalescing around a message that is really anchored in safety at the forefront, right? Like, how do we create more safety in communities and not set up this dichotomy where safety is in contrast, right? Like the path to safety is punishment, or it's safety or justice, but that you can have both. And it's been really interesting. It's just caused me to reflect, because I think it's been really interesting to watch that. I see it gaining a lot of traction. I also talk to people who feel like that way of crafting the narrative misses a lot, right? Because it sort of puts like just straight up, this is unjust or unfair or racist or like in the background of the conversation, right? And center something else that I think might have that sort of narrative potential of getting, a lot of people excited about it. But also I think maybe for those who are most directly affected can feel like it's only telling a part of the story. So I don't know. One thing I've been thinking about is like, what are the set of narratives? And if you believe, as some, folks who work in the policy arena do, that you can't advance policy change unless you get a narrative that like 70% of the public is motivated by, then what do we think those things are? And are we moving down the right path towards a narrative that is motivating? So I really wonder about that, and I wonder about that tension, and have felt that tension in my work as a funder. The other side of that is building the capacity to really fight the damaging narratives in ways that are more powerful. And I think about the work that I know some folks are doing. I'll name one organization that comes to mind. It's newer, called the Democratizing Justice Initiative, which is really focused on combating police unions as a real driver of a lot of the damaging narratives that do push punitive approaches, that do push incarceration, policing as the solutions, to safety, and they're promoting fear, right? So I think about the need to do more, not just the affirmative crafting of a message, but also the defensive work against the messages that we know have really like dictated the path, the path towards greater incarceration and greater policing and punishment. So that's kind of one category of thoughts that was stimulated for me by this trip. The other thing, again, connects to kind of my vantage point as a funder, and it's the importance of place-based work. And so I think, Alex, you said this and put it really well. What we are seeing in the Finnish prisons is not like, let's create this perfect prison, but what I took away is we're seeing the social safety net that is envisioned as part of their society, that's important for everyone, playing out even in prisons, right? And that's the part that I think, again, it's not like let's build the perfect prison, but it's how do we build that social safety net? And the pathway to that, I think, has a lot to do with investing in place-based work, because we are a big country. It is hard to imagine that we're building that from the top down, from the federal level, but we can get a lot done by building more local or state-based, picking those pockets and building systems of support, of care, building a safety net, building more of a social welfare approach, where we have those opportunities politically and otherwise. So yeah, those are really the two things that I wanted to lift up that I took back with me.
Thank you, Alana. I really appreciate that. I just have to throw in on the narrative side. I was really struck. I can't remember which of the trips it was, but in Halden prison in Norway, talking to an officer working there. Many of you have heard Brian Stevenson say that, everybody is more than the worst thing they've ever done in their lives, right? And I had Brian as a professor in law school, and I think when he says that, it has kind of a sense of a radical notion, at least in this country. And we were talking to an officer who's part of a program that gets people in the prison to get certified as chefs, and he works on helping them place in restaurants after their release. And because of their prison policies, because of their carceral policies and sentencing structure, in order to spend significant time in a maximum security prison in Norway, meant you have to commit very serious crimes, right? A lot of the people in the program are there for murder. And so somebody on our trip asked him, like, does it concern you that the people you're training are coming out and working in your restaurants and in your community, whatever? And he said just sort of offhand, he was like, no, I mean, everybody is, much more than the worst thing they ever did in their lives. He said this in English. And it was just so, so ingrained in the culture there that it didn't have that sense of revelation to it. It was just sort of part of what's accepted. That narrative had already become deeply ingrained, even in the culture of the folks who work in the prison. So I am really struck by the power of that. So I'm going to move to our last question before we move to Q&A. So this is for Shamika, but really for all of you, if we have time. And this really goes to what Alex raised, and I think we've all sort of raised this in various ways. It's like really easy to slip into this utopian view of the Nordic model, but we've heard about the key challenges that these countries face, and that includes sustaining these policy commitments in the face of this really rightward shift in government, which is happening really throughout Europe, but quite significantly in Finland, to some degree in Norway and other Nordic countries. Since we were in Finland last year, we've learned that their prison population has increased significantly. They're having to cut back in services and hire less experienced staff. We see this similar backlash against progressive policies here in the US. So starting with you, Shamika, are there strategies that advocates can take away from these challenges and applying them to our work here? That is the holding the line against backlash, which we see the pendulum swing a lot here, back and forth. I think Finland is experiencing a pendulum swing that they haven't in many decades. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I think, I want to take a step back, because what you and Alana were talking about around the narrative and the values like playing out in the prison systems. When I went, I was deep in work on juvenile justice, and so I was really paying a lot of attention to the young people and the youth. And one of the things we were looking at was that both systems had very few young people in the system, and gets back to Alex's work, and that was part of because of the age of culpability. And when we were thinking about sort of the shift as Alex mentioned, around the increase now in the political climate, the increase is in foreign nationals. And we were already seeing it then when we were there in 2019. So there were like 4 young people, and they were all kind of, I think there was like 2 who were not foreign born and the other 2 were foreign born. And so you could already see this trend line happening where the us versus them, the sort of all those narratives are starting to seep into the atmosphere. And I think it just is a reminder to us that even in these most robust systems, they're not immune to the political shifts, right? And the economic pressures that arise when you have these narratives being pushed, right? And so in the broader sort of global patterns of austerity measures, right? So like if we only have a little, then it needs to go to these people and not these other people. And so it can really undermine progressive gains that are really, you feel like are very strongholds that have been secured for decades at this point in the Nordic countries. So anyway, so I think the things that I've been taking away as we continue to follow the experience of those who are going and coming back and just listening and trying to learn is just that, one, we can't give up on like the importance of coalition building and the public buy-in, because as Alana was saying, so much of it to maintain our gains and wins, that we have to ensure that people are with us, and we have to have that public support, because then it's harder to dismantle when there are the political shifts. So if I see your child as my child, which I think is what really shifted the best interest of the child, like your nephew is a child that I could see in my community that I can uphold. I value children. Then I will less likely be able to accept a policy that says, well, I'm going to put a child away for the rest of their life. Like you just won't. So I think part of that is really making sure that we continue to build that political, that buy-in from the public, framing the issues as shared values, that they're not just values for my community, but they're values for all of us. It provides safety for all of us, to really cross those political lines. Like I often look at these polls and you'll see that over a majority of people support, rent control, all these things. And then when you talk about the political divide, you're like, well, wait a minute, you said you supported this. But then when you put the political lens on it, it really shifts people's dynamics on the public policy. So, and then I often think about just institutionalizing programs and budgets. So like we don't have the luxury in some states to have those, multi-year budgets, but we do at the federal level. There's a lot of things that we can do to institutionalize and make sure that, different administrations, we can kind of lock in some of those gains for at least a couple cycles before they could be dismantled. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about, because, when we went there, they were on a place where there was a lot to showcase, because it had been decades of showing of these reforms being in place. And now you see the shifts. And so how can we avoid some of that as we move forward?
And I'll just add, there's a lot of talk in sort of bringing that kind of model to the United States. I know California is sort of deemed the California model. I think it's a mistake to think that we're going to tweak things and make it better. If history is any guide, that we're just setting up ourselves for failure there. I just think our sense of punitiveness is like chloride in our water, and it infects all of us, right? Across our political divides, across racial lines, all of it, right? I'm someone who spent 12 years in prison out of a 14-year prison sentence. And I have walked around here in Lower Manhattan in some winters, and I have seen people suffering from a mental illness crises and a t-shirt and said to myself, damn, I've had better days than this person in a maximum security prison. But that person, whether they're having a mental illness crisis, whether they're living in a tent in the Tenderloin in San Francisco or homeless in Skid Row, we don't have the same level of compassion as we should for those folks. And that's the thing that is actually valuable about going to Finland, because you just don't see that. You don't see citizens just walking around being okay with people defecating in front of your building and just walking around it, right? And I think that we sometimes want to divide ourselves into like liberals and conservatives, right? But there's a lot of liberals that are actually okay with walking around those kinds of things. And I think that until we begin just to not be okay with having, people living on the streets, we're gonna have a system of mass incarceration, because we can't even have compassion for the person that we see in the street when we walk out of our building or our homes. How are we going to have compassion to the people who we don't even see, who have been disappeared for decades into our prison system?
Thanks for that, Alex. And I think that actually gives us a good opening to turn to one of the questions, because someone had asked that they'd love to hear more about how Norway and Finland view the problem of homelessness as related to recent criminalization of homelessness by the Supreme Court. So I know, Alex, you talked a little bit about what you saw at the organization. I don't know if you have a further to say about how they address homelessness.
I mean, I don't quite remember all of the strategies that they laid out. I just remembered that they center that strategy in a way to lower their incarceration rate, which I thought was just mind blowing, and it created a paradigm shift in my mind about how we should tackle ending mass incarceration. And they just center that, and also, I'll say that they're having a lot of trouble with when introducing sort of difference in their society, and they're struggling with that, right? Because that system wasn't created for people like us, right? That system was created for people who look just exactly like the leaders of that country, a homogenous system. And now that you have immigrants coming in, they're actually questioning their values, whether they believe that this should be upheld for Syrian refugees, right? And I think that's the key part that we need to grapple with, that we have a multicultural democracy, and we believe that Black people, Latinos, poor whites should be treated a certain way, and people with the means, socioeconomic advantages, should be treated differently. And when we went to that organization to discuss their strategy, I think we were talking to like the people who will be kind of on our side here in the United States, right? And I don't think that may very, very well last in Finland.
Yeah, they've taken a very aggressive housing first approach to homelessness, which is advocated for here by many who look at our growing unhoused population, and it has been quite successful, but it is facing the strains, as Alex said. I'm going to turn to the questions, because I know we have some really interesting questions, and I want to give us a chance to answer them. I'm going to jump around a little bit here. Alana, you brought up cooking inside, and there's a question here about asking what the food looked like in the Nordic prisons. What tools were available for cooking, and did folks have a choice in what they could cook?
Oh gosh, I don't think I can give a super detailed answer here. I will say that in the open prisons, I remember particularly the one on Semolina Island, because it was just so striking to have a prison in such just like open, close proximity to, tourists, vacationing families. Like, I recall that there were no gates or walls, but there was like a little low kind of, I don't know, maybe it was waist high, like partial kind of marker. And we asked about it, and they said it had been put there because tourists kept wandering in thinking it was like a coffee house or something, and that they could hang out, and it was violating the privacy of the people who lived there. So anyway, I recall that, and I recall people being able to, yes, because they would go to school or work, have funding to be able to take the bus and go do those things and take advantage again of the social welfare system that's available to everyone, right? By going to college for free and what have you. And then also got, as part of that, a stipend to be able to, yes, buy their own food and cook it in the housing that was there. So there was definitely this, this question of like, did folks have a choice in that setting? They could. In the open prisons, it seemed like, yes, they had a choice, and they, had money to be able to make their own choices and about what to cook. And there were kitchens available for that purpose. But as Alex pointed out, there were other settings that were, that were more reminiscent of kind of a prison in the United States in terms of the sort of physical infrastructure. And there, I do not recall that, that level of choice around cooking one's own food, or making, food choices.
Can I share on Norway side, Michaela? So I do remember, because this is very striking. So one, I think in the bungalows this was a maximum security prison that they lived in, they actually were able to, they had meals brought in, but then they could cook their own food. And they had menus, and they could decide like who was cooking what, so they could cook together or share. And then often whoever was on duty, so the guard, was eating meals with them. They ate together. So that was really interesting. And because most of those guards are social workers, I think somebody asked a comment about that in the chat. So that was striking. And then in addition, there was actually a grocery store, like a real grocery store inside the prison walls, where folks could buy eggs, fresh fruit, like all these different things, to go back and cook in their bungalow. So that was really striking too.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to get in another question here. I guess this is for you, Shamika. I like the comment that Shamika said, poverty is a policy choice. How do we get our government to change policy when so many here are against socialism?
Yeah, I mean, that's my daily work, is trying to figure that out. I think part of it is the narratives, as Alana talked about. One of the things that we didn't get into today, but we did, I forgot who came on or who spoke, but I think it was one of the professors on our trip. And I remember him saying that this isn't all socialism. Like, Norway is a capitalistic country. And so it wasn't as if folks were making these like broad social policies because they cared as much, but it was also rooted in some capitalistic notions around what made a good economy. And so I thought, so that's something I keep with me a lot, because part of what, as I sort of started to talk about, the Reagan era was really about shifting like the values, who is valued in this country, in a way in which the public policies reflected that differently than in slavery, right? And so I think part of what we're constantly doing is trying to shift that narrative around the fact that, investing in children, investing in public education, not dismantling communities and families, lowering incarceration rates actually makes for good public policy across the board, is something that we're often up against, is, this narrative that you're making us socialist, when in fact it's just making us a better country overall. So that is part of the work that we continue to do.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to try my own attempt at an answer to a few of these. I'm just going to try to weave together something here, because we've got so many questions and not that much time. But so someone has asked about San Quentin and the effort to kind of bring the Nordic model inside. Someone else has asked about lessons around solitary confinement. And someone has asked about prison and labor inside prisons. What does it look like? And the thing that I want to say is that, for me, one of the lessons that I really took away from both countries, but was made really clear by the folks in Norway who run their prison system, is that you can't scale up what they do. They are very clear about that. And I went into those systems and said, okay, well, they look significantly more humane, not perfect at all. There's still prisons, there's all kinds of problems, but significantly more humane. But of course, right, they just have so few people in prison. None of these institutes, they have, something like 2,500 people in prison in the whole country. No institution more than like 200 people. Their housing units never have more than 10 or 12 at the most. Everyone has their own room. So, okay, because they have so few people, they can do this. And we have so many more, you can't. And they put it very differently. They said, you can't do this at scale. And so we made a commitment to this, and that means we can't scale up. That means that when we have upward pressures on our prison system, we have to find safety valves to get people out. Otherwise, we lose our commitment to this system. That it's actually the commitment to a very different set of values and the way the institutions run that keeps the prison population small, keeps their incarceration rate low. Now, there are pressures on that system that are blowing that apart right now, I think, on both Norway and Finland to some degree, not anything like what we have, but right, those upward pressures are winning. And so you do see an increase in the use of solitary confinement where it was quite constrained in the past. But that, I think that they would say, is a function of what happens when the system gets too big, when you don't have the staff, when you can't make the commitment to the kind of like human interaction and humanizing environment and wraparound support that were providing for every person in that institution. When that starts to fray, then they start looking for management processes, and that turns into solitary confinement. Similarly, right, they were committed to every person gets to choose whether they go to school or whether they work, or neither. If they do neither, they don't get paid. They get paid the same amount to go to school or to work. They're not, living wages, but significantly higher than the wages we have in this country. And they have education that they can fully transport outside because nobody knows where they got it, right? Their degrees and their certificates are identical to what they would receive on the outside. And so in many ways, those commitments start to fray when the system gets too big. And it's I have a lot of concerns about the attempts, and what Alex said, I agree completely. Like, I don't think we should even be trying to pick up the Nordic model, but I understand the desire, right? You see something that is so much better, the desire, maybe we can take pieces of this. I think the challenge starts with the fact that you can't scale up what they do, and I don't see any effort to scale down what we're doing. So that's my effort at like a very quick response to a few of the questions here. I think we have time for one more. I guess I don't remember whether Alana or Alex, you saw this, but it's a question about the closed women's unit in Hämeenlinna. That was the closed prison for women, having laptops in the cell to use digital services directly from the cell, which actually I think we saw in the men's prison as well.
What's the question? I mean,
it's just what any thoughts about that, about the value of it or not?
I guess my simple answer is, I think this attention to what are people's human rights and to what extent are those maintained while one is incarcerated. And I think like access to information and to be able to communicate with loved ones, for example, that feels pretty fundamental. So having that access in, the closed women's unit, like what I think about it is that seems great. That seems important. I don't remember specifically seeing that there. I feel like I remember seeing it in the closed men's prison, perhaps, that there was some, more access to the internet and that people were using it for communication purposes with, family and friends. And that felt like an important thing to provide.
Just to add, I think we were just really skeptical of the framing of a smart prison and just making technology more available. And I guess, our American understanding of things was, I think, coloring the way that we viewed their world, because we were like, wait a minute, are they gonna be like surveilling and like making money of this system? So we were like super skeptical. But I think in the main, it actually is a good thing that they have more technology available. But again, we brought our American framework, and I don't know if that was it kind of gave us a real understanding of what was happening there. And I just want to just leave you that Finland has a prison population of around 3,000 people in the entire country, right? And Alabama has a comparable population, but has 25,000 people incarcerated, right? So just to talk about the scale of it is just so vast of a difference.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I see we're out of time. We could probably talk for several more hours, and I know there's some great questions that we weren't able to get to. I really want to thank Shamika and Alex and Alana for your really thoughtful comments and for traveling with us. It was a real pleasure to travel with you and to continue this conversation with you. I look forward to having more, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.